Today we're talking mindfulness, or as I like to say, the myth of mindfulness. I think Australian contemporary society really likes to frame mindfulness as an elitist activity. I think there's lots of schools of thought around mindfulness that almost make it sound unobtainable. I really want to break that down and really want to assist people in realising that it's more achievable than you would think. So when we say mindfulness, I think most people have this image of somebody sitting there meditating and being mindful and connecting with something. And for a lot of us, it seems really unobtainable. We're far too interested in the engagement of life, and therefore sitting down cross-legged thinking about nothing seems a little bit intimidating. So I understand that, because that's not how I practice mindfulness either. So for me, when we talk mindfulness, there's three main thinkers that I like to access: Alan Watts, Nietzsche, and Csikszentmihalyi. Alan Watts was a philosopher who was largely understood as being the cat that really assisted with bringing Eastern thought into Western society. So when I read The Way of Zen, it really helped me understand mindfulness and meditation in a whole different way. One of the more interesting parts about The Way of Zen is Alan Watts' experience of being in a Zen monastery and really learning that the practice of Zen meditation is not just sitting and thinking about nothingness and emptying your mind. There's a beautiful quote saying that monasteries are more about practice than they are about teaching. Zen's a really lived form of mindfulness. Walking meditations, gardening meditation, tea ceremonies. Lots of Zen meditation is actually executed or performed in the act of living. And that's really how I like to approach meditative and mindfulness practice. One of my favourite thinkers is Nietzsche, and he has a way of talking about complete and utter involvement. He's a big fan of Dionysian thought and of Dionysian practice. He loves the concept of music and of festivals and of parties. So Nietzsche has this great critique about the difference between appreciating art, like a painting on the wall, and then appreciating music. Music is something that's experienced, it's something that's embodied. I'm not having a go at fine art on the wall, don't get me wrong, but there's something about music, and it's a collective shared experience. We all know that feeling of being at a gig and being so enthralled in the gig and being so connected to the crowd that you almost become one entity. There's very little individual I in that space. It's more about the actual group act, the Dionysian frenzy. That for me is another really good way of understanding mindfulness. Anytime you get close to transcending the ego or transcending that kind of isolated I, like me, Tony, oh, I'm feeling so anxious right now and I'm so scared and tired and hungry. When you're engaged in an activity that holds your attention to the point when you lose yourself, that's how I like to understand mindfulness. Now, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and that is not pronounced anything like it is spelt, which is confusing and amusing all at the same time. He was the guy who coined the term flow. And when he talks about flow, he's talking about being engaged in an activity where you feel like you're in the zone. And he has some quite specific parameters around that. And they're actually really interesting. I'm going to share them with you. So there's four main things you need to keep in mind when you're engaging in an activity that you're hoping is going to result in the experience of flow. Now I'm talking about flow, and we can substitute that for mindfulness, mindfulness, flow, flow, mindfulness. To me, both of them are the same thing. I just think flow is a really lived version of mindfulness. So there's four things you've got to remember. So when we think of flow, we need to think of the activity that we're engaged in. So flow is usually about an activity, okay? There's two aspects to that activity. There's the challenge or the complexity of the activity, and then there's the skill set of the person engaging in that activity. And so flow sits somewhere in the middle of that. We're going to draw a graph, all right? And I'll show you an image here that I drew to explain what it is that I'm talking about. So there's levels of complexity, if you think of them going up. And then there's your skill set, and if you think of that expanding out. Now, in order for you to experience flow, which is right the sweet spot in the middle of that, you need to be engaged in a task that is challenging and requires skill. Now, if the skill set you have is way beyond what's necessary in order to engage in that activity, then you're going to find that boring. Now, as soon as we're bored with an exercise, our mind tends to wander, so we wouldn't obtain that feeling of flow, and we also would not be engaging in what would be called a mindfulness practice. Being bored is not being mindful. And likewise, if the task you're engaging in is too complex or too challenging for your current skill set, then the result will be you feeling inadequate, anxious, or literally just not even being able to engage in the task. So that, again, you are stuck in your head. You get stuck in the personal narrative. Like, this is too hard, I can't do this. What if I hurt myself? Or everyone's going to laugh at me? All that kind of stuff, okay? There's another really important element to flow, and that is that the activity that you're engaged in doesn't really have an end point. So what that means is, as a musician, for example, I can play for the rest of my life. I will never figure out music. I will never complete music. It's not a task that is done. Oh, there you go, I've finished music. Great. That's not how it works. And so in order for me to feel flow as a musician, to experience being in the zone, as my skill set expands, as I become a better musician, I engage in more and more complex activities. And therefore, I'm able to stay in that sweet spot, that flow spot. And it's when you're in that sweet spot where your skill set and the complexity of the task are aligned, that's when the engagement in that activity becomes so enthralling that you lose yourself. Transcendental meditation is largely aimed at transcending the individual encapsulated I, the ego, and losing yourself. Now, you can sit there and stare at the back of your eyelids for hours on end to try and get there, or you can access that same notion of transcendence by engaging in an activity that you find rewarding, challenging, enjoyable, where your skill set and the complexity of the task are constantly expanding. That's what they call flow. That's how I practice mindfulness, and I highly recommend it. Some of my client work, and the aim of this vlog, is to demystify mindfulness and is to open up the concept of flow, and that the pursuit of flow and the engagement in an activity where you experience flow has all the same psychological, philosophical, spiritual benefits of mindfulness. For me, it's more enjoyable, it's more lived, it's more embodied. So a really easy way of understanding my skill set versus the complexity of the task is when I'm paddling. If I'm paddling on flat water, don't get me wrong, it's an awesomely satisfying activity, but my mind can tend to wander because my skill set far exceeds the challenges that the water is throwing at me at that point in time. However, when I paddle in slightly rougher conditions, I totally transcend myself more often than not because I'm watching the waves, I'm watching the water, I'm mindful of where the wind is, and I sit in that space of flow because my skill set is being challenged because the complexity of the task or the situation changed and became more demanding. Hang on. Oh. Now that potentially is somebody experiencing flow. As we speak, I would say that her skill set is being challenged by the complexity of the situation that she's engaging in. She's got enough skill to stay in the boat, but the conditions are challenging enough that they're requiring her to be mindful and present of the task at hand, or face falling out. So Alan Watts has got this beautiful quote of saying that any human activity can be turned into an act of meditation simply by being with it, by being present with it. You know when you're being mindful, simply because the I is not as loud as it is when you're walking down the street wondering if people are judging you. You know when you're engaged in flow because you can finish the activity and realise that you really need to eat and you really need to go to the toilet. We've all had that experience. Another way to assess whether that experience was close to what Csikszentmihalyi was talking about when he says flow is the feel-good sensations you're left with at the end of it. So my challenge that I put to you all is to examine your life, think of the activities that you find the most rewarding. I bet they have some commonalities, and that would be that you need some form of skill set to engage in them, that the activity itself has a complexity that can increase as your skill set gets better, and that if you follow that as far as you can, you will never get to the end of it, you will never finish it, you will never complete it. It's those kind of activities that provide you with the experience of flow. It's those kind of activities where I think mindfulness is best accessed. It's those kind of activities that make a life worth living. It's those kind of activities that help you with seeing the awe in the everyday. If you're paying attention, life is awesome.